The sun hung low over the Montana grasslands, casting long shadows across Daniel McAllister's sprawling cattle ranch. From the main house's porch, you could see thousands of acres rolling toward the distant mountains, dotted with Herefords that looked like tiny specks from this distance. It was 1887, and the McAllister Ranch had become one of the most prosperous operations in 3 counties. Daniel stood at the fence line, watching his foreman drive a new herd toward the northern pasture. At 32, he cut an impressive figure, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and wind, with dark hair that fell just past his collar. Women in town whispered about him at church socials and barn dances. Their mothers whispered louder, wondering why such a catch remained stubbornly unmarried. "Your father and I are concerned," Margaret McAllister announced one evening over dinner, her silver fork clicking against fine china they'd hauled across half the continent. "The Hendersons have a lovely daughter. Emily is 17, cultured, and her mother says she embroiders beautifully." Daniel pushed potatoes around his plate. "I'm sure she does." "The Pritchards have 2 unmarried girls," his father added, not looking up from cutting his steak. "Either would bring a substantial dowry." "I don't need a dowry, Pa. We've got more money than we can spend in 3 lifetimes." Margaret set down her fork with deliberate precision. "This isn't about money, Daniel. It's about legacy, about grandchildren to inherit all this." She gestured toward the window, where the last light gilded the endless grassland. "About our family's place in this territory." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'll marry when I'm ready. Good night." He left them in the dining room, escaped to the barn where the horses nickered softly in their stalls. He ran his hand along the smooth wood of a stall door, worn by years of use. This barn held more memories than the grand house his parents had built 5 years ago. There had been another barn once, smaller, on the property they'd first homesteaded. Daniel had been 10 years old, all knees and elbows, when the O'Brien family settled on the adjacent claim. They'd been poor, the kind of poor that showed in patched clothes and hollow cheeks. But James O'Brien had been a hard worker, determined to make something of the rocky soil he'd claimed. Sarah O'Brien had been 8, with wild auburn hair that never stayed in its braids and eyes the color of creek water in summer. While Daniel's family prospered, the O'Briens struggled. But Sarah never complained. She'd helped her father from sunup to sundown, small hands learning to milk cows, feed chickens, mend fences. Daniel taught her to ride. She taught him which wildflowers you could eat when you were miles from home and hungry. They'd spent hours at the creek boundary between their properties, Daniel showing off by skipping stones while Sarah told elaborate stories about the clouds overhead. One summer afternoon when she was 14 and he 16, they'd sat in the old barn during a thunderstorm. Lightning crackled across the sky and Sarah had been frightened. Daniel had held her hand, promised he'd always keep her safe. 3 months later, the O'Briens were gone. Drought had finally broken them. The crops failed completely, their few cattle died, and they disappeared in the night, unable to face their creditors. Daniel's father had purchased their land for back taxes. Daniel had searched every town within 50 miles, but Sarah and her family had vanished like smoke. He'd been 16 and certain his heart had broken permanently. Now, at 32, he knew it had just scarred over, leaving him unable to accept any of the pretty, suitable young women paraded before him. None of them had creek water eyes or told stories about clouds. Margaret and Thomas McAllister held a private conference in Thomas's study 2 weeks after that uncomfortable dinner. "The boy's becoming a hermit," Thomas said, pouring bourbon into cut crystal glasses. 32 years old and acting like some sort of tragic poet. "I've made inquiries," Margaret said quietly. "There's an agency in San Francisco that arranges marriages, mail-order brides for Western territories." Thomas looked up sharply. "Those are for miners and sodbusters who can't attract wives. We're McAllisters." "Precisely, which is why we can be selective." Margaret pulled a letter from her handbag. "I've corresponded with them discreetly. They maintain lists of young women seeking Western husbands, women from respectable families facing financial difficulties." "Daniel would never agree. Daniel doesn't need to agree. We arrange it, present it as fait accompli. Once the girl arrives, propriety will force him to go through with the marriage. You know how he is about honor and duty." Thomas swirled his bourbon, considering. "It's underhanded. It's necessary. Do you want the McAllister name dying with Daniel?" They examined the agency's list by lamplight. Most prospects required substantial payments. Dowries in reverse, money sent to struggling families in exchange for their daughters. The prices varied based on youth, beauty, education, refinement. Margaret's finger stopped on an entry near the bottom. This one's remarkably inexpensive. There must be something wrong with her. The notation says she's larger than typical. Obese, the agent writes, from a farming family in Nebraska, 26 years old, never married. The family's desperate, crop failures, debts. They're willing to accept any reasonable offer. Thomas frowned. Daniel would be furious if we brought him a fat wife. Exactly. Margaret's smile was cold. He's been too proud, too selective. Let him have a wife who isn't some perfect beauty. It'll teach him that beggars can't be choosers, even wealthy beggars. And a plain, grateful wife will make him a better husband than some spoiled belle. You're playing a dangerous game, Margaret. I'm securing our legacy. This girl, Sarah O'Brien is her name coincidentally, will arrive expecting marriage. Daniel's honor won't allow him to refuse her publicly. Once married, he'll settle down, accept his responsibilities, and we'll have gotten exactly what we want for the cheapest price possible. The arrangements were made in secret. Money changed hands. Letters were sent and received without Daniel's knowledge. The agency assured the McAllisters that Sarah O'Brien was desperate enough to accept any situation. Her family's farm had failed completely, and her brothers had already headed to California looking for work. Marriage was her only option besides destitution. What the McAllisters didn't know was that Sarah hadn't chosen this path. Her remaining family, an uncle who'd inherited the farm's debts, had effectively sold her to the agency, signing papers on her behalf. Sarah had been given a choice between marrying a stranger out west or being thrown out with nothing. News spread through the ranch community like wildfire. The McAllisters were bringing in a mail-order bride for Daniel. Gossip crackled across fence lines, in general stores, at Sunday services. "Heard she's big as a barn," said Ed Peterson at the feed store, his voice carrying to where ranch hands loaded supplies. "Someone told me nobody else would take her," added his wife, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Guess even the McAllisters' money couldn't buy quality." The ranch hands working for Daniel tried to look busy, but they exchanged glances. Their boss, fair, hard-working, who mucked stalls alongside them when needed, was about to be saddled with some unfortunate woman for reasons they couldn't fathom. Daniel learned about the arrangement 3 days before Sarah's scheduled arrival. He'd been checking fence lines in the north pasture when he returned to find his mother and the family's lawyer in the sitting room. "What's this about a bride arriving Saturday?" His voice was dangerously quiet. Margaret lifted her chin. "We've arranged a suitable marriage for you. The young woman arrives on the afternoon train." "You did what?" "You left us no choice, Daniel. You refused every reasonable prospect. This way, the decision is made." "You bought me a wife, like purchasing cattle?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "The arrangement is legal, Mr. McAllister. The young lady has signed contracts. If you refuse to honor the agreement now, there could be breach of contract implications, not to mention the scandal. The entire county knows she's arriving." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "Who is she?" "A farmer's daughter from Nebraska, 26 years old. Good health, can read and write. Her family needed financial assistance, and we've provided it in exchange for the marriage arrangement." "What aren't you telling me?" Margaret's pause was fractional. "She's not a conventional beauty. But that's hardly important in a marriage, is it? Character and dedication matter more." Daniel stared at his mother, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time. She'd done this deliberately, chosen someone she thought would humble him, force him into compliance. "If I refuse?" "Then you destroy that girl's reputation and future," Margaret said simply. "The whole territory knows she's arriving as your bride. If you reject her publicly, she'll be ruined. Is that the man you want to be?" He wasn't, and she knew it. Daniel had been trapped as neatly as a wolf in a steel jaw. Saturday arrived with cloudless skies and blistering heat. The entire ranch buzzed with speculation. Several neighboring families had found reasons to visit, ostensibly on business, but really to witness the spectacle of Daniel McAllister's mail-order bride arriving. The train station sat at the edge of their small town, a weathered building beside iron tracks that stretched toward horizons. Daniel stood on the platform, flanked by his parents, while curious onlookers pretended to busy themselves nearby. "Big as a milk cow, I heard," someone whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Probably why nobody else wanted her. McAllister's got the bargain basement bride. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Whatever poor woman was arriving deserved better than this circus, even if he resented his parents' manipulation. The train whistled in the distance, a lonely sound across the prairie. Black smoke plumed against the blue sky as the locomotive pulled into the station with grinding wheels and hissing steam. Passengers disembarked, a merchant family, 2 cowboys, a salesman with sample cases. Then a woman stepped down from the last passenger car. She was large, there was no denying it. Her dress, though clean and carefully pressed, strained across a body that carried significant weight. She moved carefully, as if expecting judgment with every step. Her auburn hair was pinned severely back under a simple bonnet, and she kept her eyes fixed on the platform boards. The crowd's whispers intensified. "Oh my. Look at the size of her. Poor Daniel." But Daniel wasn't looking at her size. He was frozen, staring, because he could see her face now as she lifted her head to navigate the platform steps. It was impossible. It couldn't be. But it was. Sarah O'Brien. Not the girl he'd known. That girl had been thin as a rail, all sharp edges and hunger. This woman carried weight, moved differently, dressed in worn clothes that spoke of poverty. But the face was the same. Older, marked by hardship, but unmistakably the girl who'd told him stories about clouds, who'd held his hand during thunderstorms, who'd disappeared 16 years ago. "Sarah?" His voice came out strangled. Her head snapped up at the sound of her name. Those creek-water eyes widened in shock as she saw him, really saw him for the first time. The papers she'd been clutching slipped from her hands, scattering across the platform. "Daniel?" It was barely a whisper. "Daniel McAllister?" The crowd fell silent, sensing drama but not understanding its source. Sarah swayed slightly, her face draining of color. She'd known she was being sent to marry a rancher named McAllister in Montana. But McAllister wasn't an uncommon name, and she'd never imagined, never even considered. Daniel's mother stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Young woman, you're expected to present your papers to—" "Ma'am, I know who she is." Daniel's voice cut through his mother's words like a blade. His eyes never left Sarah's face. "This is Sarah O'Brien, from the homestead next to our first property." Margaret's face went white. "That's impossible. The agency said she was from Nebraska." "My uncle moved us to Nebraska after the drought," Sarah said quietly, finding her voice. She looked between Daniel and his parents, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You didn't know. Neither of us knew." The irony was devastating. Margaret had chosen the cheapest bride on the list, never imagining she was selecting the one girl Daniel had never forgotten. Sarah had signed papers to marry a stranger, never dreaming that stranger was the boy who'd once promised to keep her safe. "Well, isn't this romantic?" a voice called from the crowd. Ed Peterson, unable to resist. "The rich rancher and his childhood sweetheart. Too bad she's twice the size she used to be. Guess that's what happens when you can finally afford to eat, eh?" Cruel laughter rippled through the onlookers. Sarah's face flushed crimson, and she looked down again, shoulders hunching as if to make herself smaller. Daniel saw the gesture and felt rage surge through him, rage at his parents for creating this situation, at the crowd for their cruelty, at the agency that had trafficked in human beings, at the world that had broken the O'Brien family and scattered them. But mostly, he felt rage at himself for not looking harder 16 years ago. He strode forward, past his parents, past propriety, directly to Sarah. The crowd quieted, watching. He bent, collected her scattered papers from the platform, then straightened and met her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying across the platform. "I'm sorry we're meeting again like this. I'm sorry for what my parents did. I'm sorry I didn't find you 16 years ago." Sarah shook her head slightly. "You couldn't have known. I should have tried harder." He glanced at the gawking crowd, then back to her. "You don't have to do this. The contracts, the arrangement, I don't care about any of it. If you want to leave, I'll pay your passage anywhere you want to go. If you want to stay but not marry, I'll set you up with your own property, your own money. You owe me nothing." "Daniel, think about what you're saying," his father hissed, "in front of all these people." "What I'm saying," Daniel said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is that if anyone has wronged Miss O'Brien, it's us, not her. She came here in good faith, and she deserves to be treated with respect and given real choices." Margaret grabbed his arm. The scandal? I don't give a damn about scandal. Daniel gently removed his mother's hand. I care about doing right by someone who is wronged by this entire situation. He turned back to Sarah, lowering his voice so only she could hear. What do you want, Sarah? Not what your family wants, not what my parents want. What do you want? Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the crowd waited breathlessly. She could see the boy she'd known in this man's face, the same directness, the same essential decency. But she also saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of expectations he carried. Can we talk somewhere private? She asked finally. I need time to think. Of course. Daniel offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah took it. He guided her toward the wagon, ignoring his parents' protests and the crowd's whispers. As they passed Ed Peterson, Daniel paused. Ed, the next time you feel the need to comment on a lady's appearance, remember that I hold the mortgage on your South 40 acres. Just a friendly reminder. Ed's face went red, but he said nothing. The ride to the ranch was quiet. Margaret and Thomas had taken a separate carriage, leaving Daniel and Sarah alone in the wagon, except for the young ranch hand driving. Sarah kept her hands folded in her lap, staring at the landscape rolling past. It's beautiful, she said finally. I'd forgotten how big the sky is out here. Tell me what happened after you left, Daniel said quietly. If you want to. Sarah was silent for a moment, gathering memories. Uncle James, my father's brother, took us to Nebraska. He had a claim there. My father worked himself into an early grave trying to make that rocky soil produce. My mother died of pneumonia 2 winters later. My brothers left for California 5 years ago. I stayed to help Uncle James, but she trailed off. But? The drought hit Nebraska too. Uncle James drank away what little we had. He contacted the agency behind my back, signed papers saying he had authority over me. I found out 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave. He told me I could either go west or be thrown out with nothing. So here I am. Her voice was matter of fact, but Daniel heard the pain beneath it. What about you? Sarah asked. How did you end up like this? She gestured at the sprawling landscape, the distant ranch buildings coming into view. My father made smart investments. We bought land cheap when others were failing. Cattle prices rose. We got lucky. Daniel didn't say what they both knew, that the McAllisters' fortune had been built in part on the failures of families like the O'Briens. I never forgot you, Sarah. I looked for you for years. I never forgot you either. Sarah's voice was soft. You were the only friend I had out here. When we left, I thought my heart would break. They reached the ranch as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. The main house stood imposing and grand, 3 stories of milled lumber and glass windows that must have cost a fortune to transport. Sarah looked at it, then down at her worn dress and scuffed shoes. Daniel, I need to be honest with you, she said as he helped her down from the wagon. I'm not the girl you knew. I'm not young anymore. I'm not pretty, and I know nothing about being a lady in a house like this. Your mother chose me because I was cheap and unmarriageable. She wanted to teach you a lesson. My mother made a mistake, Daniel said. Not because you're not good enough. You're better than any of us deserve. She made a mistake because she tried to manipulate people's lives like moving pieces on a chessboard. But I'm not going to compound that mistake by making you feel unwanted. He led her up the porch steps and into the grand foyer. Margaret and Thomas were already there, waiting. Several ranch hands had found excuses to be nearby, curious about the new arrival. Daniel stopped in the center of the foyer, where everyone could see and hear. This is Sarah O'Brien, he announced. She's going to be staying with us. Anyone who treats her with anything less than complete respect will be looking for a new job. Is that understood? The hands nodded, shifting uncomfortably. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but Daniel held up a hand. Sarah and I need time to talk and figure things out. She's not obligated to marry me or anyone else. What happens next is between her and me. He turned to Sarah. I'll have Mrs. Chen, she's our housekeeper, show you to a room. You can rest, clean up, whatever you need. We'll talk after supper if you're up for it. Sarah nodded, grateful for the reprieve. An older Chinese woman appeared from a side hallway, her expression kind. This way, miss. I have a nice room prepared. As Sarah followed Mrs. Chen up the grand staircase, she heard Margaret's sharp voice behind her. Daniel, we need to discuss this privately. No, Mother. We need to discuss it never. You did what you did. Now I'll handle it my way. Sarah's assigned room was larger than any space she'd ever called her own. It had a real bed with a feather mattress, a washstand with porcelain pitcher and basin, even curtains that matched the bedspread. Mrs. Chen showed her how to work the lamp and where fresh towels were kept. "Dinner in 2 hours," Mrs. Chen said. "You need anything? You call. I'm in the kitchen most times." After she left, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling. The reunion with Daniel felt like something from a fever dream. Of all the ranches in Montana, all the men who might have purchased a mail-order bride, how had she ended up here? She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand. The reflection showed a heavy-set woman in a threadbare dress, face lined by hardship and hunger and survival. She'd gained weight in the past few years. Ironically, since her uncle had started drinking, she'd often raided his hidden food supplies, eating when she could because she never knew when the next meal might come. Her body had changed, expanded, become something society viewed as shameful. But she'd survived. That had to count for something. She washed her face and hands, changed into the only other dress she owned, slightly less worn than the travel dress. Then she sat by the window, watching the sun paint the grasslands gold and crimson, and waited. Supper was an uncomfortable affair. The McAllisters' dining room could seat 20, but tonight only 4 people occupied one end of the long table. Margaret sat rigid and silent. Thomas attempted small talk about ranch business. Daniel kept glancing at Sarah, who pushed food around her plate, acutely aware of Margaret's disapproving gaze every time she lifted her fork. "The beef is wonderful," Sarah offered, trying to ease the tension. "It ought to be," Margaret said coldly. "It comes from our own cattle, the best stock in 3 counties. "Mother," Daniel warned, "I'm simply stating facts. This ranch represents 3 generations of work. Everything here is the result of sacrifice and proper decisions." Sarah set down her fork carefully. "Mrs. McAllister, I understand you're angry. You arranged something specific, and I complicated it by being someone Daniel knew. But I want you to know I didn't come here to trap him or take advantage. I came because I had no other choice. If you want me to leave, I'll leave." "And go where?" Margaret's smile was brittle. "With what money? Your uncle already spent what we paid." Daniel's chair scraped back violently. "That's enough. Sarah, would you take a walk with me? The sunset's nice from the ridge." Sarah nodded gratefully and followed him from the dining room. Behind them, Thomas's voice rose in quiet argument with Margaret, but Daniel closed the door on their words. Outside, the air had cooled to comfortable. Daniel led Sarah past the barns and corrals, up a gentle slope that overlooked the property. From here, you could see why the McAllisters had prospered. Water from 2 creeks, natural grass, shelter from winter storms. "Your mother's right to be angry," Sarah said. "I'm not what she wanted for you." "My mother wanted control," Daniel corrected. "She wanted me married off so she could have grandchildren to shape and mold into little McAllisters. She didn't care who I married as long as I married." He paused. "When I saw your face at the station, I thought I was hallucinating. 16 years, Sarah. 16 years I wondered what happened to you." "I thought about you too. Whenever things got really hard, I'd remember that summer before we left. Remember the creek and the barn and—" She trailed off. "And the thunderstorm?" Daniel finished softly. "And the thunderstorm?" Sarah smiled slightly. "You promised you'd always keep me safe. Then we were gone the next day. I tried to find you. I rode to every town within 50 miles. My parents forbade me from going farther, said I was being ridiculous over some poor neighbor girl." His voice carried old bitterness. "Eventually I gave up, started thinking maybe you'd been right. Maybe I couldn't keep everyone safe." They stood in silence, watching the last light fade. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Daniel, what do you want from this situation? Honestly." He turned to look at her. "Honestly, I want you to stay. Not because of any contract, not because of my parents' scheme. I want you to stay because you're Sarah. Because I spent 16 years with a hole in my life where you used to be. Because when I saw your face today, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Like maybe there was a point to all this." He gestured at the ranch spread below them. "I'm not the girl you knew," Sarah said carefully. "I'm older. She struggled for words. "I'm bigger. I know that's difficult for you to... Do you think I care about that? Daniel's voice was fierce. Sarah, I watched you survive things that would have broken most people. You helped your family when you were barely old enough to understand what poverty meant. You kept going when you had every reason to quit. That's what I see when I look at you, someone who's strong enough to weather any storm. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The whole town thinks you're stuck with damaged goods. The whole town can go to hell. I don't care what they think. I care what you think, what you want. Daniel took her hands carefully, as if afraid she might bolt. Stay, Sarah. Not as some obligation or charity case. Stay because I'm asking you to. We can take it slow. You can have your own room, your own space. We can get reacquainted. And if eventually you decide you want to make this marriage real, then we'll do it right. But it's your choice. Always. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, his calloused from work, hers worn from hardship. She thought about the alternatives. Returning to Nebraska with nothing, trying to start over somewhere new without resources or connections. But more than that, she thought about the boy who'd taught her to ride, who'd shared his lunch when she'd been too proud to admit she was hungry, who'd held her hand during a thunderstorm and promised to keep her safe. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. The next weeks were strange and difficult. Sarah moved through the grand house feeling like an imposter, too aware of the elegant furnishings and her own shabby dresses. Margaret maintained icy silence, speaking to Sarah only when absolutely necessary. Thomas watched with wary eyes, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve. But Daniel kept his word. Sarah had her own room, her own space. He introduced her to the ranch operations, showed her the account books, explained how everything worked. He didn't hide behind pretense or try to sugarcoat the fact that much of the McAllister wealth had been built on others' failures. This land we're standing on, he said one day, showing her the old O'Brien claim. This was your father's homestead. My father bought it for back taxes. Technically, it should have been yours. Sarah looked across the land, now lush and productive under McAllister management. My father couldn't make it work. That's not your fault. Isn't it? My family had capital. We could afford to wait out bad years, buy better stock, make improvements. Your family was one crop failure away from ruin. The system's designed to help people who already have advantages. So what are you going to do about it? Sarah asked. The question hung between them. Daniel had never really considered what he could do. He'd inherited wealth and used it to generate more wealth. What did he owe to the people left behind? That night, Sarah found him in his office, surrounded by papers. What's all this? Researching how other ranches handle hiring, Daniel said. I want to bring on more men, families if they want, pay decent wages, provide housing, not just seasonal work but real employment. He looked up at her. Your question got me thinking. I can't fix the whole system, but I can fix how this ranch operates. Sarah sat down across from him. You'll need better winter storage for hay if you're expanding the herds. And the water rights for the western section, you're not using them efficiently. Daniel blinked. How do you know that? I can read ranch account books, Daniel. I've been studying yours. You're overgrazing the near pastures and underutilizing the far ones. And your cheese and butter production is non-existent. You're missing a whole revenue stream from your dairy cows. Over the next hour, Sarah outlined changes she'd noticed while exploring the ranch. She'd grown up working farms, understood animal husbandry and crop rotation, knew how to stretch resources and maximize output. Daniel listened, occasionally interjecting questions, and slowly began to see his ranch through new eyes. Why didn't you mention any of this before? He asked finally. Sarah shrugged. Wasn't my place. I'm just the mail-order bride nobody wanted, remember? Don't. Daniel's voice was sharp. Don't call yourself that. It's what everyone thinks. I don't care what everyone thinks. I care what's true. And the truth is, you're smarter about ranch operations than half my foremen combined. He gathered the papers, energized. Can you write up these ideas properly? I want to implement them. Daniel, your mother will have a fit if you start taking advice from me. My mother doesn't run this ranch. I do, and I'm asking for your help. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, but I'll need access to all the account books, supply inventories, and herd records. Done. They worked together long into the night, Sarah's practical knowledge combining with Daniel's capital and authority. By dawn, They had a plan that would transform ranch operations. The changes started slowly. Daniel hired 3 new families, giving them small parcels to work in exchange for labor. Sarah set up a proper dairy operation, teaching women in the community how to make cheese and butter that could be sold in town. She reorganized the winter feeding schedules, reducing hay consumption by nearly 30% while keeping cattle healthier. The ranch hands noticed the improvements came from Sarah's suggestions. The women working in the new dairy operation saw how she rolled up her sleeves and worked alongside them, never acting superior despite being the owner's intended wife. Slowly, opinions began to shift. Miss O'Brien figured out why our calving rate was low, one foreman told another. Something about mineral deficiency in the south pasture. She was right, added supplements and the cows are doing better. She taught my wife that cheese-making technique, another added. Mary's over the moon about it. Says she can actually contribute money to the household now. Even in town, the whispers changed. The general store owner noticed that products bearing the McAllister Ranch label, Sarah's dairy products, sold faster than others. The banker remarked to Thomas that the ranch's profit margins had increased noticeably. Margaret noticed too. One evening, she cornered Sarah in the hallway. "I underestimated you," Margaret said coldly. "That doesn't mean I approve." "I'm not asking for your approval, Mrs. McAllister. I'm just trying to be useful." "Useful?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "You've made yourself indispensable to my son. Very clever." "I love him," Sarah said quietly. "I loved him when we were children, and I love him now. If you think I'm here for his money, you're wrong. I'm here because he asked me to stay and because I can't imagine being anywhere else." She walked away, leaving Margaret staring after her. Summer turned to autumn. The ranch prepared for winter, storing hay and supplies according to Sarah's revised schedules. Daniel and Sarah fell into comfortable partnership, working together daily, eating meals together, talking long into the evenings about everything and nothing. One night in September, they rode up to the ridge where he'd asked her to stay. The air was cool, carrying the scent of distant snow from the mountains. "Sarah," Daniel said quietly, "I need to ask you something." "All right." "Do you want to make this marriage real? Not because of contracts or obligation, but because you want to?" Sarah turned to look at him. In the moonlight, she could see the vulnerability in his face, the fear that she might say no. "I've been yours since I was 8 years old," she said. "I just didn't know if you still wanted me." "Didn't know." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "Sarah, I've loved you for 16 years. The girl you were, the woman you've become, all of it. If you'll have me, I'd like to marry you properly. Not some arrangement made by meddling parents, but a real choice we both make." "Yes," Sarah whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Sarah felt the last pieces of her heart settle into place. They married in October, with half the territory in attendance. Not the quick, practical ceremony Margaret had envisioned, but a real wedding with flowers and music and a party that lasted into the night. Sarah wore a dress Daniel had commissioned from the finest seamstress in the territory, designed to fit her perfectly, without apology. When Ed Peterson made a snide comment about the fat bride finally getting her hooks in, Daniel overheard. He didn't cause a scene. He simply walked over and said conversationally, "Ed, you remember that mortgage I mentioned? I'm calling it due. You have 30 days. Ed paled. "But that'll ruin me. Then maybe you'll think twice about insulting my wife." Daniel smiled pleasantly. "Or you can apologize to her publicly and I'll extend the loan another 5 years. Ed apologized, profusely. Margaret attended the wedding but said little. Thomas surprisingly pulled Sarah aside after the ceremony. "I was wrong about you," he said gruffly. "Thought you were just some desperate girl looking for security. But you've been good for Daniel, good for the ranch, good for all of us, really." He paused awkwardly. "Welcome to the family." Sarah blinked back tears. "Thank you." The reception was joyous. Ranch hands danced with their wives. Neighbors who'd once whispered about the mail-order bride now toasted the couple's happiness. Sarah danced with Daniel under strings of lanterns, feeling lighter than she had in years. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, holding her close. I'm thinking about that thunderstorm, Sarah said, when you promised to keep me safe. I didn't do a very good job of it. You did fine. We found our way back to each other, didn't we? Maybe that's what keeping someone safe really means, being there when they need you, even if the path is longer than you expected. Daniel pulled her closer. Then I promise to keep being there, for as long as you'll have me. That's going to be a very long time, Sarah warned. Good. They danced until the stars wheeled overhead, two people who'd been lost and found, bought and sold, underestimated and overlooked, but who'd somehow ended up exactly where they belonged. 5 years later, the McAllister Ranch was the most prosperous operation in Montana Territory. But its success wasn't measured just in cattle or acres. It was measured in the families who worked there with security and dignity, in the women who earned independent income from the dairy operation, in the community that had learned to value people over appearances. Sarah ran much of the operation now, her business sense and practical knowledge having proven invaluable. She was respected throughout the territory, not despite her appearance, but because of her competence. Margaret eventually softened, particularly after her first grandchild was born, a daughter with her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady gaze. Thomas admitted openly that Sarah had been the best thing to happen to the family in decades, and when people told the story of how Daniel and Sarah McAllister met, they left out the parts about mail-order brides and desperate arrangements. They told a different story, about childhood sweethearts separated by hardship and reunited by chance, about love that survived poverty and pride and the cruelty of strangers. Though it's funny, people would say, when you think about it, the richest rancher in Montana ended up marrying the so-called bride nobody wanted. Just goes to show, doesn't it? It showed that justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet and persistent, like water wearing down stone. It's in the reversal of expectations, in the underestimated proving their worth, in love that refuses to be defined by society's narrow standards. Daniel had bought a bride nobody wanted, but what he'd actually found was the one person he'd wanted all along, someone who'd been his from that first summer by the creek, through 16 years of separation, across impossible circumstances, right back to where they both belonged. And if that wasn't justice, it was something better. It was home.